the Everything But Politics podcast.
Welcome back to the Everything But Politics podcast. My name is Merrick Leeser alongside Ethan and Evan Leeser. And today we are joined by the #1 back pain specialist on the planet. He's improved the quality of life for a countless number of people. He's the founder of BackFitPro and the author of Biomechanics. Dr. Stuart McGill, welcome to the podcast. It's great to meet you. Thanks for taking the time.
Well, hello, Merrick, Ethan, and Evan. I'll keep all of those straight now. And I understand you're based in Chicago. Is that?
Yeah, we are in Northwest Indiana in a town called Munster, about 40 minutes from Chicago.
Okay. Oh, very nice.
Yes, so not
Fantastic.
far. And that's where we're calling from at this moment. So it's good to have you here in Munster.
You can see outside our windows here, we are having extreme forest fire smoke. It's almost like it's dusk out there, but Northern Ontario is having some major fires at the moment. And no sun here.
Okay, well, wishing you and everyone up in Northern Ontario safety and coolness. So I'd love to begin, Dr. McGill, if you could start by sharing your background and where your expertise lies.
Well, my background is not what I ever expected to be or to become. And truth be known, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. So there's an odd start to the whole thing. But I went to university really for sports. And I got interested in the academics with exposure to really, really good professors. And then I ended up doing a master's degree in biomechanics and then a Ph.D. I was accepted for a Ph.D. in systems engineering, something very different. But I was playing hockey for the professors team in the University of Ottawa, and we played another team, and one of the players was Dr. Bob Norman. And in the Professors League, the host team buys the beer, and both teams come to the host dressing room and drink beer after the game. And I sat beside Bob Norman, and who was ended up as my PhD supervisor, and he said, "I'm just starting a spine lab, systems engineering, but why don't you come by for a visit?" Anyway, that's how I ended up doing a PhD in spine biomechanics. And I started as a young professor there, simply asking one question: how does the spine work? And it's my personality, I suppose. I love to know how things work, and I probe them and play with them to try and investigate how these things work. And we started developing a lab where we would measure the stresses inside people's bodies as they were doing things with a focus on the spine. And I was noticing that most of the back pain, not always, but most of it is related to where the stress concentrations are the highest. And then I realized, well, I need to apply these stress concentrations to spines to see if, in fact, they create the injuries. In other words, get a one-to-one match. And so we did this to cadaveric spines. And I know they're dead cadavers, but they're the best that we had. And of course, we were able to replicate the injuries and thus the pain patterns. And then I started a radiology lab suite with ultrasound and CT and X-ray and all of these sorts of things to see if those images were able to detect the pain pathways. Then I was asked to start a spine clinic, an experimental research clinic at the university. Well, I hadn't come through a traditional medical background. I was much more on the engineering side. So I set aside 2-hour appointments to see back pain clients, and my medical colleagues said, 2 hours? What are you going to do for 2 hours? And then my engineering brain said, I'm going to troubleshoot them. You know, I was had my wood chipper going this morning and I couldn't get it to start. Hadn't started for a year. And you know, for a gas engine, you need compression, spark, and fuel. And that's where you start your troubleshooting. So that was my beginning of assessments. It was not a medical school taught assessment at all. So we developed our own procedures to troubleshoot a person's back pain. And a curious thing happened. After the first year, I changed the 2-hour appointment into a 3-hour, and we would use all sorts of instrumentation. We would measure them doing different things. We would ask them to do activities of daily life, and if they were an athlete, we would get them to do their athletic endeavors, and we would see with some specificity the pathway of their pain. Then we were able to create a strategy matched to their specific pain to wind it down and then retune their body, so to speak, to fill in the gaps of what they needed but currently didn't have. So I don't know if that was the answer you were looking for, but that's what happened, I suppose. And now I'm trying to retire, and
too many people
depend
depend on you. Let's I think something that people get confused, self included, and I'm not sure if there is a difference, so I'd love if you could share. When you think of back pain, you think of my back is in pain. Is there a difference between back pain and spinal pain?
If I was to turn the question around and I said to you, is there a difference between femur pain and leg pain? Well, I think that would depend on who you are. So if you knew enough about the pain pathway in your leg and you could attribute it to your femur, your kneecap, or compression ischemia or whatever it happens to be, you would say, all right. But it's interesting. Most people talk about back pain. Most of the time, the spine itself is centrally a player in that, but not always. So is that, I think it really depends on the person who's consuming this.
Got it. Understood.
And what type of physical activity would you recommend is best for back pain? When I had some back pain in the past, I found that yoga was extremely helpful. What would you recommend?
Okay, that's a fabulous way to pose that question. There are generic answers to the question, which you are headed towards, and there are specific answers to the question. So you are an individual with a very specific phenotype of your back and certain ratios that influence stress concentrations and that kind of thing. Let me just tell a little bit of a story, and it will really set the background for the answer. And the answer is yoga might have been fabulous for you. It might be poison for the next person with back pain. So that's where I'm headed with this. But I'm just going to take you through, let's do a sporting example. We took a volleyball team, and the coach said, would you help train this team and increase their vertical jump? And of course, we did a squat training program. So all the players did a squat training regimen for a period of time. And I forget how long it was, 8 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever it was. Well, the curious thing was, at the end of the training regimen, half the team jumped higher. 30% of the team actually lost some vertical height, and 20% there was no difference. So on average, there was a very minor bias to jumping higher. But that's not where the gold was. The gold was some people were responders to the program, and other people were non-responders to exactly the same exposure because of their phenotypes were different. And so what were the phenotypes? Well, I said to the players, are you naturally quick? Or are you naturally strong? Okay, well, think that through for a moment. If you were naturally quick and you did a strength training program, do you think that would help you to jump higher, or it would take an inch or two off your vertical. So you're
Could probably
naturally
take
quick
an inch or
now.
two off.
And actually, it was if you were naturally strong and you added more strength to strength actually creates stiffness. So clench your muscles as hard as you can and really create strength. Do you see you're frozen? So yeah, but in order to throw a punch, you have to pulse and then relax. Do you get what I mean? So speed and
I
movement
get it.
comes from relaxation. So to keep adding more strength to strength actually decreased their vertical jump. Whereas if they have a very sparky neurology and they had a pulse, boom, and then they could let the relaxation phase occur after the initial strength pulse, they could jump higher. So if you could strengthen the pulse even more, but training speed is a very difficult thing to do. It's easier to train strength. But anyway, my point in that story is that was the phenotype that determined the difference in reaction to exactly the same stimulus. I could tell. And another one happened to be the length of their body as a ratio to the length of their legs. So, some people have very long legs and short bodies, and other people have longer bodies and shorter legs. So, as it turned out, the ones with longer legs tend to use their hips as power sources, and the ones with shorter legs tend to use their knees as power sources. So now we're getting down to the short strokes. Would a back squat versus a front squat been better for either group? And the answer was yes, it was. It suited their phenotype better. So now we go back to your question, Evan. Yoga may have worked very well for you. And what is yoga? Yoga is a whole spectrum of, there's body weight strength, there's mobility, there's some hip centric and shoulder centric mobility, some spine mobility. In other words, even the type of yoga might have helped you or not. And there's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine called Your Spine, Your Yoga. And he's got another book in the series, Your Body, Your Yoga. And he actually does, he walks the reader through a self-assessment and then shows them what specific yoga they should be doing for their particular body phenotype. So that's my answer to your question. I'm so glad yoga helped you. But it might be the poison or preventing another person with back pain. So if they had an assessment to understand their phenotype and their specific back pain mechanism, they would then know, A, is yoga appropriate or more of a stabilization kind of approach, perhaps with less mobility, might be directly addressing their pain pathway. So long-winded answer, but I think you get the idea.
Yeah. Appropriately named El Corazon, the heart, is a culmination of strenuous labor and enduring passion for exceptional coffee. Not just any coffee, Brickhouse coffee. This organic gem embodies the very essence of Brickhouse coffee in many more ways than one. Each sip reveals the culture and authenticity of the farmer's personal touch, nurtured through organic practices, lightly roasted, flavorful, and highly satisfying. Each certified organic bean is a gift from our Honduran brothers and sisters, and we're proud to extend this pure and heartfelt piece of our heart to you. Brickhouse Coffee, El Corazon. Get it now, link in description.
Yeah, thank you.
Doctor, for our listeners who may not be familiar with the term phenotype, what does that mean to you?
Excellent. Let me take an example of a spinal disc. So a spine is made with blocks of bone, and in between the blocks, there are discs made of collagen fibers that form a fabric. There are several phenotypes or differences in the fibers that hold the fabric together. And that means everything in terms of what activities suit one person and what their injury mechanisms are. So let me give you another example. I'm going to continue with that example. So we've got the disc between the vertebra with collagen fibers that on the outer layer run at about 30 degrees one way. And then on the next concentric layer, they run 30 degrees the other way. And then the next layer and the next layer, etc. Those collagen fibers form a fabric. So your disc is actually a biological fabric. Now my shirt is a fabric. So I'm going to take my shirt and I'm going to create stress strain reversals like this, back and forth. The shirt may not tear, but the fibers of the fabric will slowly delaminate, and I will create a hole at the highest stress concentration. Everyone agreed?
Yes.
Okay. There is a ground substance that holds the fibers together in a human disc. One type of binding collagen can withstand repeated stress strain reversals. So they do well with yoga and a lot of bending motions with their spine, etc. That the other phenotype does not bind the collagen very well. They tend to allow the fibers to work apart. And when they work apart, the gel nucleus inside the disc works its way through like this and creates a disc bulge. So do you see one person with the phenotype of this less binding collagen, they tend to have back pain episodes from bending forward, doing gardening, maybe round back squats and these kinds of things. But the next person doesn't. So that's on the injury mechanism side of the phenotype. But now when we get into the resilience side, which is the reciprocal, the collagen that isn't loose, that is quite stiff, those are the ones who tolerate high load much better, like powerlifters. Not everybody. How many yoga masters do you know of that are also powerlifters? They're usually polar opposites. Now, there are those I know that are touched by the hand of God and they can do everything with resilience. But that's not me, and it's probably not you. But there are these curious humans around that have these magical, as I said, they've just been touched by the hand of God. But most of us have predispositions to tolerating specific activities. So when we get into, what are good exercises for people, once again, do you want me to answer that question?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah. So how do we go about finding out what the best exercises are for a given individual with certain phenotypes? Now, you don't know what their phenotypes are, but we learn what they are through a speaking interview. And we learn about what causes their pain, what motions, postures, loads, activities. And that gives us a pretty good idea right there. We learn about their training programs, etc. So how shall I put this now? Pain is such a guide for us. Now, if I didn't have pain, things would be a little bit more difficult. But when a person has pain, we define with precision what specific motions, postures, loads, and activities trigger their pain. And now that tells us, well, if the exercises contain that specific trigger, they're not going to get better. So we teach them how to move in a way that doesn't trigger their pain. So those are movement exercises. And then we ask them, what are your goals? Say I want to swim. Okay, fair enough. We then say, what are the demands of swimming? Well, if they want to do front crawl, and it's a front crawl freestyle motion, and if they can't breathe properly, and if they're getting shoulder pain, it might be because they are flexed through the kyphotic spine, the upper part of the thoracic spine. If we gave them spine thoracic extension to lift like a peacock, do you see how now they get arm extension through their spine? It takes the stress concentration out of their painful shoulder. So what's the best exercise for them? It's upper spine extension drills. So we're trying to give them what they need to do that specific sport to meet the demand, but we're going to train what they currently don't have. So that's when we're not in a pain context, how we would shape and determine the optimal training program. So one with pain and then one with a performance parameter to help guide us on the formulation of those.
That's great. It's so interesting. Just dealing with such an array of people, everyone's got their own unique situations. Just fascinating. So I want to take a little step back and uncover what is something you were taught early in your medical career that you now know is completely untrue.
I don't know if I can think of one because I didn't. Here's the curious thing. I have probably taught and lectured at probably over my career close to 100 different medical institutions around the world, some really top flight ones. And yet I was never a student myself at a medical school.
The engineering background.
It was in a very medical setting, shall we say. And
sure.
but I can't think of anything that I was taught that is polar opposite. What I will say, and your listenership may find this interesting, when you go to a clinician, whether they're a orthopedic surgeon or a psychologist or psychiatrist or a chiropractor or a physical therapist, they perform procedures that they've been trained to perform and that they can bill for according to the insurance billing code. So if you go to a surgeon, all you're going to get is surgery because that's what they have been trained to do and that's what they bill for. Whether you need it or not. And we could use that as an analogy for every single clinician. So what I wish happened, we've been trying to address this ourselves, is to create spine experts. Well, who are the spine experts? There's no spine expert that is really trained at medical school. They will be trained in a silo that pertains to the spine, but what we have tried to do is to understand the biomechanics, anatomy, pathoanatomy, neurology, psychology, the endocrine system, anything to do or impacts upon back pain or back performance. And then we will take a clinician, they might be a chiro or a physio or an MD, and fill in the blanks for them. So when they listen to a person's story in the interview, we'll say, tell us your story. I need to assess your back pain. What do I need to understand to come up with the very best assessment that will allow me to understand all this? And they need to look at the person's posture. Go to a clinical psychology book and look up clinical depression, and you will see pictures of people sitting quite classically with their knees together, their hands are in their lap, and they're slouched forward in a very timid, submissive, defeated position. And then you test them, and you find out that their pain is caused by sitting slouched like this. So do you see that there is certainly a psychological component to that? But if we can show them that and lift them and start to experience a little bit of joy, and then this pain, it really, talk about a mind-body connection. My goodness. You know who does this really well? Two biological groups. One are animals. Do you think the lion looks at the pond where all the animals are drinking and he says, oh, there's a big, strong zebra. I think I'll go and have him for dinner. No, they're looking for the weak one who's slouched, poor posture, slow, etc. And criminals as well, when they're looking around for the mark. They're looking for the person who exudes weakness through their psychologically expressed demeanor of their posture. And you'll learn a lot talking. I have learned a lot when we get a client who's just got out of prison. Fantastic. I'm going to ask them all kinds of questions that I'm curious about. And you just learn gold. Or I had a client who just won the Poker Stars competition in Vegas. And I said, how do you get a pretty good idea of the hand that opponent is holding? And he was showing me the various physiological and signs that, animals can figure this out. But so I wish docs, all clinicians, would become more holistically expert in whether it's back pain or shoulder pain or whatever. Does that? It's a huge question you asked, obviously.
And I love that answer. It kind of is like the concept that nature doesn't make mistakes. It's the same energy, just exemplified through humans. I mean, we're part of nature too. So I guess that kind of leads me into, what is the relationship between emotional stress and physical pain?
Well, I can start with the hard data first. A good colleague of mine, Professor Bill Maris, who basically was my equivalent at Ohio State University. He was a professor of spine biomechanics in their engineering school. He did a really interesting series of experiments with different grad students. They would go to factories and they would mock this up. So the workers didn't really know. They were debriefed afterwards, of course, but they didn't know. A boss would come in and yell at them and berate them. And Professor Maris had instrumented the workers with instrumentation that would reveal their physiological and mechanical response. The response was primarily governed by their personality, and he did personality profiling on every worker to start. So if a person had what we would call a timid personality, when they were yelled at and stressed at work, they would recoil and they would contract their muscles. So when they bent down to pick up a part or something at the factory, the joint load would be much, much higher. So it was a beautiful study showing your emotional state determines your joint load. And if you have back pain, more joint load in odd postures is not a good thing. That's usually the primary pain driver. The people who had a much more outgoing, confident type of a personality, it was water off a duck's back. They yelled at them, so what? It didn't translate into physical stress. And you can really see this with different coaching styles on teams when I've consulted with different teams as well. You can't treat everybody the same way. Some people get fearful and they lock up and are slow. I have a very good friend who he was actually a division weight champion for a number of years in the UFC. And I said to him one time, what's the hardest part of your job? And he said, leaving my guys, my homeboys, so to speak, in the dressing room and walking through the crowd to the cage. He said, you're terrified. And this guy was the best at his job. And but he was honest, and he said, terrified. But, we select music, and then I know you guys are musicians. I select music that keeps me loose, because if I get afraid and I allow that fear into my body, I become stiff and slow, and then I get knocked out right away because my reactions are slow. And so it's the music that allows me to keep emotionally cool and don't allow that stiffness into my body, and it allows me to perform freely. So I thought as musicians, you might find that that
awesome.
cool. Yeah. So
Walkout song.
yeah. And I'm
to the rhythm of life.
I shouldn't reveal this, but some nights, when I'm out at the cabin here, and I'll come out early and my wife hasn't shown up yet, so I'll be cooking dinner in the kitchen, and I put on I just go into maybe Marvin Gaye or Motown classics or whatnot, My Girl, or it doesn't that just loosens you up, and that music is talk about getting loose. And so I shouldn't reveal this, but I'm dancing in the kitchen making dinner, just loose, and I'm a guy who can't dance, so there you go. The right music just frees your body.
I'll do it to you.
Too funny. Well, so
I had another. May I just? Sorry, can I tell another story that is really just to take another side to this? I was trying to teach footwork to a back pain client a week or two ago, because he was taking heavy objects and bending his spine around, and I said, do a drop step, do some footwork, and I said, look, let's do some ballroom dance. So I grabbed him like I was the opposite sex partner, and he froze up right away. But anyway, I said, dance with me. And by the way, this guy was a former rock star, Well, he is. He can walk down the street and people still want his autograph. So anyway, he used to be well known in the rock world. But I said, okay, now waltz with me and pretend you got your guitar and we're just going to do some footwork. And then I said, now go study Mike Tyson. And you watch him hit a heavy bag or an opponent. He drop steps, liver hook or body shot, drop steps so quickly the other way. But his rib cage and his pelvis stay together. And he creates such tremendous horsepower out of the hip joints, transmitted through the core, and then he unleashes that through the shoulders to create those devastating punches. So it all came from footwork, but I had to go back to music to get this rock star to waltz with his wife and then teach him how to turn and move smoothly to unload his back. Anyway, another music-related story with a little bit of combat athletes.
Well, something you mentioned there, which I think is really important and misunderstood when it comes to back health. So what's the relationship between back pain and tight hips?
Well, there's a lot, actually. I'll take one example of doing a deep squat. You might see someone, and people will argue about this on social media, is butt wink okay. Do you know what that is? You do a deep squat and then your back rounds out at the bottom. Okay. Well, let's start by doing a hip exam on a client. Have a client lay on a patient table and you're going to pick up their leg and push their knee up to their armpit. Well, some people have a very deep hip socket. Let's talk about phenotypes again. They've got a very deep socketed hip joint. So the ball and socket of the hip, we lift their leg up and then it collides on the deep socket of the hip socket side, and thereafter it starts to turn the pelvis. And then they'll say, oh yeah, that's my back pain. In other words, tight hips are bossing the pelvis into bending, which then puts a stress concentration. And if they have a disc bulge or pain from their spine from flexing the joint, it's the tight hip that is triggering it. And then the person might have a very shallow hip socket and their knee joint goes right up into their armpit. It's a walk in the park. There's no stress going into their back. So that would be the first consideration, is the depth of the hip socket, or they might have a damaged hip labrum, which is the cartilage around the edge, or a tight hip capsule perhaps. It might have been injured, or it might have been developmentally made tight through chronic exposure to a certain activity. And when the hip runs out of room, the spine then sees the stress. It gets bent under a load and is a pathway to pain. So that would be my first answer. Can I talk about the human linkage that you might find this interesting? Okay, our skeleton is a linkage, just like a backhoe or heavy machinery. It's very interesting. We have a backhoe here, and it's very, when I teach a kid how to operate it, there's the shoulder joint, and then there's the elbow joint, and then there's a wrist and a thumb that digs. So you have to put down the stabilizers on a backhoe to lift up the back end of the tractor to allow it to pull earth. In other words, if you don't, it'll just pull the tractor around. So you need proximal stability to get distal athleticism in a linkage. You understand this. So now you wanted to talk about the hip joint. What is the most powerful joint in the body?
Good question. I would assume it's the glute.
Yes, bingo. It's the hip joint. So the glutes, and not only do the glutes extend the hips, but they externally rotate, assisted by the hamstrings, etc. But the biggest power source in your body are the hips. Okay. But what about your knee? Your knee doesn't have much muscle around it. Basically, it's a hinge joint with a few tendons around it. So think of the linkage now. The knee will go where it's commanded by the hip. The hip goes into internal, external rotation, flexion, and extension. It's positioning the knee. The knee goes where the hip commands it to go, and the ankle allows it to go. So if you've got a tight ankle, now that gets seen by more knee stress, which affects the hip stress, which then affects the spine. So there's another take on the link between hip health and mobility, power development, etc. And the spine, which performs many functions, but it's heavily influenced by the performance of the hip.
Everything's connected.
Yeah. So do you see why? Go back to the very first question you asked me about the passion for the spine. It's never ending. It's, what you learn about music. Oh, well, that certainly affects the spine. What you learn about the linkage and mechanics and machinery and phenotypes, the psychology, the chemistry. When you said, what was it? Biology or Mother Nature makes us live by her rules is how I interpreted it. Whatever you're.
Correct. Nature doesn't make mistakes.
Nature doesn't make mistakes, and let's call her a she sets the rules, and you can violate the rules at your peril. But if you live within her rules, you can have the best chance of being having a great life. But if you want to argue with her, then you will increase your risk of not having such a good time. I sound like an old man, but anyway.
Well said.
Black and Tan. Brickhouse Coffee has welcomed this pub-inspired blend into its family as a gift to the indecisive. A flawless and balanced fusion of our darkest black roast and the flavor-packed lightly roast El Corazon. This certified organic coffee crushes the stigma of the just average middle child. Not this guy, but bold yet clean finishing. It is a delight that satisfies down to the final drop. Perfect for the whole family, regardless of rank and birth order, and crafted with the purity and care of certified organic beans. Brick House Coffee Co., the best. Now back to the episode. Now, Dr. McGill, so for those who are sitting a number of hours a day working desk jobs, what advice do you have for them about optimizing their backs, living a healthy lifestyle, and ultimately staying loose and mobile?
Okay, that's a fascinating question, and it's probably not the answer you're going to expect. And I'm going to start with the word "it depends," and I'm going to say it depends because you used you constrained me by saying back health, not overall health. So can I answer it first with answering your question, which is particularly for back health?
Please, yes.
Okay, there are some people who are couch potatoes, and they spend their massive part of their life sitting, and they have no back pain. And yet there are others, and they sit for a short period of time, and it is the main driver of their pain. So they have sit-stand chairs, and they fidget about, etc. That's an interesting start of the question. But if you would allow me to expand it to general health, sitting is awful for your general health for lengths of time. Now, if you are a physical
get up, I gotta move.
Well, that's it. I used to, when I was lecturing, my lectures were an hour and a half long. At the 45-minute mark, everybody stood up and they walked around. And we did a little, Or I was at a spine conference about a month ago in South Africa, and those guys sat for 5 days listening to different speeches and whatnot. I couldn't stand it. I thought, come on, guys.
No pun intended.
Anyway, yeah, I'm old enough that I can give my unpopular views, and they all said, "Oh yeah, you're right," But anyway, sitting does all sorts, and I'm talking about prolonged sittings. Yeah, if you are a plumber or an electrician and you sit down for a break, that's great. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a person who lives and dies by their computer these days. It's a real problem from a cardiovascular point of view, from an eye health point of view, from a musculoskeletal point of view. If you sit a lot, chances are the psoas muscles become a little bit tighter. The back muscles become a little less endurable. Just a whole host of declining events occur. So, is that more of the answer you were looking for?
Yeah.
We're gonna get a standing
Yeah,
Yes.
we like standing.
Yeah.
So something
Yeah.
that's been a hot topic in the health and wellness world the last couple of years is what they call grounding. Basically putting your bare
Yeah.
feet or your bare skin on the grass, on the ground, on earth. And they say reduces inflammation, has all sorts of other great benefits. What is your experience with grounding? Do you recommend it to your patients, and how do you feel about it?
Well, first of all, I would never broach that topic because I'm not the expert. So I'm very
Mm.
careful to stay in my lane if I'm with a client. Now, I have a lot of colleagues that I would refer to, and if someone asked me that question, I would refer them out. So that is my official answer. But you asked me personally, I can tell you that here I take my shoes and socks off and I walk on the bare granite for simply that reason. It feels good, and I have little
Yep.
challenges that I give myself to walk over a specific surface in bare feet, or to climb, or to do whatever it is. That's
Beautiful.
a beautiful, 100% personal though. And then we built a shower
Yeah.
here
Yeah.
with a stone pebble on the
Lovely.
floor,
It's beautiful.
just
Yeah, we also
for
very
that.
much enjoy walking on the earth every morning. We go outside and just walk on the grass, and whether it does what they say or not, it feels great. And it's just definitely a good thing to do. Another thing that is really big right now is like the vibrational, like the Theragun or like the roller with the vibrating to get the blood moving. What are your thoughts on those devices that have the vibrating um, thing to them where you could vibrate your back or your feet? How do you feel about using those to reduce pain?
I am not opposed to foam rolling extremities, glutes, quads. Some people foam roll lats and triceps and these kinds of things. We've had some poor outcome and bad experiences with people foam rolling their back. And to be specific, having the roller across their back, they're laying on it with their full body weight going up and down, and it has created or exacerbated individual spinal joint instability. So
Interesting.
now it does fire off a stretch reflex, which gives the person the 20-minute euphoria, neurologic euphoria, or analgesia from the stretch reflex. And then afterwards, oh, my back is not feeling good at that place again. So, there's one vertebra on top of the other. This is compression, but this is shear. So if a person has shear instability and they foam roll on a back and they trigger off that instability, that's not a good thing. So anyone who has joint instability, back pain, I would tell them, please do not foam roll it.
Mm. Good to
My
know.
logic would then be is, why do you feel the need for foam rolling? And let's get down to what the causal mechanism is and address that. And if you still need some kind of release, you're far better off to go to a skilled body worker who can
Mm.
use their hands and target what the original pathway or mechanism is, but they know enough to leave the instability alone. In other words, it's not a general massage at all. It's a very clever, well thought out strategic one. But anyway, a bit of a longer answer.
No,
Yeah.
perfect.
Now, something that we do a third of our lives is sleep. Is there a certain way we should be laying down when we go to sleep to optimize for back health?
Absolutely, yes. But I can't give you a generic answer for everyone, but I'll tell you how to get there as an individual. So when a person says, oh, I say, when you wake up in the morning, is that a good time or a not so good time? So that's how I might start that in a back pain interview. And if they say, oh, I'm quite fine, end of story. Usually their mattress and sleeping positions are good. But if they wake up and they say, no, that's a really challenging time for me, my back is stiff, it takes me a while to get going, then I'll say, all right, tell me about your mattress. And now we get into the sleep science literature. If you are a triangle, so you three looking at you would be classed as triangles. You've got wide shoulders, narrower waists, athletic builds. Generally speaking, you do better on a firmer foundational mattress with a generous pillow top, something like, say, a Sealy Posturepedic extra firm commercial grade with a very generous pillow top. If you are a square, which would be a much heavier man who the phenotype would be they're heavy, they lay on their back and they snore. They do much better on the Tempur-Pedic beds because they mold down into the foam with the heat of their body. But think of it, in order to roll, you've got to do physical work to roll up out of the depression, and that might trigger their back pain. So now we're getting into suiting the mattress to the individual. Then if they say, well, the character of my pain when I'm laying in bed is I will lay on one side and I get a grumpy back and I roll to the other side and it relieves my back pain, but then it gets going after a while. So then I'll say, okay, let's lay down. So we lay them down on the assessment table and I wait for just a little bit of discomfort to occur. And then I'll put one hand under their rib cage and one hand under their iliac crest of their hips. And I play a little jazz. I give a bit more support under the rib cage, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, that took my pain away," or it might make their pain worse. In other words, if I could fold a towel to replicate what my hands just showed was the pain mechanism, their pain is usually due to a micro movement. So I mentioned earlier, this is compression, but this is shear of their spine. And if they have a joint that's lost a little bit of shear stiffness or shear instability, and they lay on their side and they're built like you guys, wider shoulders, narrower waist, you see how that puts shear stress on the joint? And then I will say, okay, let's put a folded towel strategically under there. Does that take your ache away? Yes. And then a few minutes more, it starts up again. And I say, okay, push your right heel away. Yeah, that took my pain away. Or let's try a thicker pillow between your knees. In other words, we're migrating stress concentrations and we're supporting the instabilities. And then they lay on the other side. So basically, and this is a truism, the number of pillows that people go to bed with indicates and correlates with the number of joint instabilities that they have. But it makes perfect sense now when you think it through. You use those pillows to posture out the stresses, align them, take the stress concentrations out, and remove the pain. So after that, some people enjoy sleeping on their tummies, on their sides, on their back. There's no, I know some people will say, oh, well, this is the best position and this is a poor position. We don't go with that at all. We assess the person, but I've given you some of the logic that we would use to determine their specific pain mechanism and address it.
Well, so from what I understand at this point in the conversation is that a lot of these mechanisms, it's to each their own. Everyone's different. Everyone has something that'll work best for them with regards to sleep, physical activity, nutrition, whether when they sit, walking. So with to each their own, something that appears to be universal is your McGill Big 3. Can you share what the McGill Big 3 is and why it's so effective?
Yeah, of course. You can go on YouTube and see literally hundreds of videos of people demonstrating the Big 3. How many have I put on? 0. And there's a reason for that. They are 3 basic exercise forms that about 35 or 40 years ago, I was searching for the very best way to create stabilization exercises for the back in a way that spared the back of high load. So very conserving exercises that guaranteed joint stability. And the ones that kept rising up to the top, being superior, were the bird dog, the side plank, and the modified.
Now, I want to quickly state, I did all 3 this morning, and I'm not in back pain, but after concluding, I felt great. I felt loose. I felt ready to go about my day.
I've done them for 40 years, and most of our patients will do a form of them. But then a client will come in and say, "Well, I can't do them. I've had knee replacement." Well, then we will do them standing at the kitchen table. You put one hand on a kitchen chair and you do a bird dog standing. So as an example. So that's where those exercises came from. But then I see these people demonstrating them that have never taken our courses, and they are totally unqualified to administer or design therapeutic exercise. Let me talk about the flaws. You start on your hands and knees, and some people raise their leg up way past parallel, higher. And when you examine it, they're lifting with their back, cranking their back into extension, versus stabilizing their back and pushing the heel away, making themselves long. Now, what you did was you created a battleship out of your core, and you moved the responsibility to support the load to your glutes and hamstrings. Now we're talking. And then with the opposite arm, squeeze the hand, make a fist. With the stance arm, try and pull it down to your feet. Don't, but just try to engage the lats on the other side. The next person, that gives them back pain. So you may have to back off on the arm pull, or in other words, you really romance those exercises to the individual. How long do you hold them? I see people hold it for 1 second, and then that does nothing. The idea is to hold them for about 10 seconds minimum per side, and how we build the sets and reps. There's a lot of science to all of this. So until I know some characteristic about the individual, I can't prescribe the exact subform of the big three and what's the prescription of sets and reps and all the rest of it. But anyway, and by the way, we would never give a person with back pain just the big three. Even before we talk about those things, we're giving them strategies to remove the cause. With the big three, we'll be adding walking regimens. Ask your aunt. I hope she's doing the full. If she went to Dr. Kamisa, I know she would have got a lot more than the big three. Maybe she'd be doing hip mobility and all kinds of things that are addressing the impediments of her not getting better in the past. Anyway, I hope that's maybe I should
certainly. So I'm happy you mentioned my aunt, because I was just going to pivot towards that. So she had mentioned that for her experience, she was in such crippling pain. It was affecting her daily life. She really could do things. She was just kind of stuck. Yeah, she was stuck. So with that said, she discovered you and your work, and she's been working with Dr. Joe Kamisa in New Jersey. Why is your methods and Dr. Kamisa's method so effective that allowed her to kind of continue on with her life and her health and fulfilling herself?
Well, I would ask her. What I would expect she would say is that she'd been to a dozen different clinicians before, and no one gave her an assessment to determine the specific pathway of her pain, her body type, her age, her history of exposures and injuries and this kind of thing, or current fitness level. So what Kamisa would have done is a very thorough assessment to give her a precise understanding of her pain pathway. And then you create the intervention that addresses it. Stop the cause and give her exercises that give her what she needs that she currently doesn't have to live robustly. So that's it in a nutshell. But that's very rare.
I love that word, robustly. Is that kind of the word that relieves or frees a lot of people from their pain? Kind of, they become more robust.
I'm going to, before I use the word robust, I would use the word empowerment. Think. Do you want to talk a little bit of psychology for a minute?
Always. Let's go.
Oh, okay. So think of the person, and I'm sure you have a few friends and family members where they did something quite benign and they got a stab of pain in their back that was really debilitating. They might have been bending down to feed the dog or pulling a weed or, something quite minor. And that pain was punishing. They were probably locked up for 2 or 3 days, really, really painful. And they didn't know what caused it. That is a psychological bogeyman. Could you imagine going through life, and it was so poignant. I remember a woman who just got out of prison and the university, and I was taking her down to the exam room, and she came around the corner, and a student came around the corner and surprised her, and she just she just jumped like she was being jumped in prison. And she was a very muscular lady, and she was wearing a tank top, and I saw all the fascia and muscle striations in her body. Talk about just crushing her body, and she had, an acute episode. In other words, that unknowing of their pain was a bogeyman. And it's like a man that can jump out at any time and stab you. Wouldn't that give you psychological distress? Think about it. Just going to school, walking down the street, and someone's going to come up behind you and stick a knife in you. That's terribly traumatizing. And yet that is how some people live with their back pain. Very fragile, very fearful because of the bogeyman. What we do is show them what the bogeyman is. And it's usually something quite simple in terms of very specific motions and postures. When you bend forward, instead of bending through your spine, bend forward through your hips. Your aunt will show you. I'm sure Dr. Camisa showed her.
Yeah.
And simply that made the trigger impossible to create a full-blown episode. In other words, she understood the bogeyman. She was empowered. She became confident. And you see how now she's just so psychologically empowered. Now she's out of jail and she can start living a resilient, robust, fun life. Life is so fun. It's just awful when you see people not experiencing life to its potential. And it starts with that empowerment bit through knowledge and strategy, and now get on life and squeeze the hell out of it. I've got an athlete, and she actually plays on the tour, like a very, very well-known athlete. And I can't tell you who it was, but she had the bogeyman factor in her when she was playing, and in her sport, every effort they make is 100%. And she just was inhibited and not living in this fear. But every time I meet her now, we have a little thing, and I say, well, how's it going? And her answer is always, I'm just squeezing life by the balls. And it's our little confirmation of we're having fun. And
I like that a lot.
do you know what I mean? It's just that little affirmation every day. And if you're going to talk to Professor McGill, I want that affirmation that you're living your best life and just squeezing every drip out of it.
Well, doctor, you guys deal with a lot of people who are rehabilitating. They need rehab. They come to you because they're hurt. Is there any advice you have for people who want to prehab? And when I say prehab, I'm talking about people who have not hurt their backs. They don't want to hurt their backs. And prehab is something you keep in mind so you don't have to go to rehab. Any advice you have for people who don't have back pain and want to keep it that way?
It's a fabulous question. In my experience, it's a very difficult thing. And the reason is it's very difficult to motivate the uninjured. So it's like a kid, you're trying to say, well, don't smoke. Well, the smoking takes a lot of years before you get detrimental effects. So they don't see it right away. But now they're in the cancer ward and they think, geez, I wish I didn't smoke. And so it's kind of like that. You could say to a person, you're blessed in that you have these natural resiliences and phenotypes. You're exploiting them. In my experience, is all you can really say at this point. The volume that you're going through now is excessive if you don't take more deloads in your training or whatever it happens to be. So I think that's what you're talking a little bit. Or it might be your style of play right now is not matching your hip architecture. So either we do some stretch work with your hips, and it may be that you've got nothing more in your hips. It's just the way you are. It's bone to bone. It's the way God made you. Or I might send you to one of the very best hip mobility experts that I know of, And we did an experiment together where we took Canadian hockey players who have notoriously stiff hips. If you know the game of hockey, they don't use a lot of hip mobility, and the pulling the equipment through with every stride with heavy skates and whatnot, they tend to get stiffer hips. She took a group of players who were in the 5th percentile for hip mobility. Everyone was a hockey player. She did a 3-dimensional, static, dynamic, PNF style of stretching, just fabulous stretching. And on average, those players got to 75th percentile, more than average. So it does show you that a well-designed scientific program is fabulous for prehab and reducing stress constant. And the context of that particular study, we were asking the question, why do some people go on the elliptical machine and say it hurts my back, and why other people go on the elliptical machine and they say my back feels great? It's like going back to your question about yoga, Evan. You know,
Yep.
on an elliptical, some people say it's fabulous and some people say it's poison. Why is that? It turned out to be hip mobility. So if you have lots of hip mobility, you can just fly on the elliptical machine and it doesn't transfer through the linkage through the pelvis into your spine. But if you have stiff hips, every turn stresses your back, bending it. Do you see what I mean? In a micro movement pattern. And eventually it'll cause, on average, that's the genesis of your back pain. So that's where that whole stretching came as an intervention. But maybe that's a good way to demonstrate how our research was motivated and driven by real world questions that came from observations from our patients. And we would just say, well, I wonder why that is. And it turns out, yet again, it's human variability and phenotypes. And
Well, Dr. Berg, I have a question about this right here. The Back Mechanic. What prompted you to write this book? And if there's one lesson you'd like a reader to get from this book, what would that be?
All right. Well, why did I write it? As most things in my life, I'm asked to do them. So I'd written a heavy medical textbook called Low Back Disorders. It's a very, very heavy read. It's, all about the assessment and prevention and different rehab approaches and whatnot, all from a back point of view. And people who aren't clinicians, they read it and they say, well, I'm a very educated lay person reader, but it's still a bit complicated. Would you write a book that I can consume as a lay public person? So I thought about it and I did. But the problem with that book was it was the most difficult book I've ever written. I've written several books. And it was, do I tell enough detail so that it is truthful? Because the publisher, when it was first shopped around by a book agent, the publishers all said, this book won't sell. It has to have a title, Fix Your Back in 3 Easy Steps. And I said, but that's a lie. It's not possible. You have to show the person, take them through a self-examination so they learn what patterns and postures and motions and loads and activities that trigger their pain. And then they do or create a strategy guided by the book to stop the cause. Well, it's 17 chapters and it's not 5 easy steps or 3 easy steps. It's a bit more complicated than that. But the feedback I get from the readers are they'll say, thank you for not treating me like a 5-year-old. You're the first guy who hasn't done that. But the opposite side was I still had to keep it readable because it's for the lay public. So do you see the challenge? I have to put enough truth and reality in it that it is truthful and helpful, but not too much that it becomes so cumbersome to read and it turns right back into a medical textbook. So that is very difficult for me to write and find that balance. But my son, I had some different editors and they just didn't capture my voice. And my son went through and made it what it is now because he knows my voice. But anyway, what do I want people to get from that? The empowerment of knowing what their back pain is. And it's quite rare, actually, that people are stuck with their pain. There are some unfortunate people, we know that we can't get everyone better. But the majority of people, if they move well, achieve a level of sustainable fitness that suits them to create this resilience for life, that's what I want them to get.
Beautiful.
Love it.
Dr. McGill, something that Ethan, Evan, and I pride ourselves on is having conversations like this that are evergreen, that will provide value today, tomorrow, in a year, in a decade, and so on. It's not timely. It's all a matter of when it finds you. This conversation has been exactly that. So really appreciate you taking the time and being with us. My final question for you, those listening that want to live extraordinary lives as you have, what advice do you have for them?
Boy, you're going to hate me again, but I have to go back to what I believe in. Everyone is an individual. Some people are timid and they need a hug. We're all hurting inside. And the best way for that person is to give them a hug. Now, you could get in trouble these days doing that, but when someone needs a hug, damn it, I give it to them. The next person, the best thing I can do for them is to wake them up a little bit and do the opposite, tough love, and tell them and encourage them to stop their current self-defeating behaviors, to get to that joyful state. So do you see, I can't give you an answer. It is so, you got to read people and converge on what your street smarts show you is what that person needs to really have fun, help other people. You know, it's all sort of anyway, I can't give that advice. It would come from me spending time with that person and trying to improve their lot with them.
Dr. McGill, I think the last hour, 10 minutes, we really grabbed this episode by the balls. Appreciate you being here with us, teaching us, and look forward to doing it again. So thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. Now I'm really curious. Do you have like any of your music online, or where can I hear you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I will share it right after this episode, but these are two of the albums. Our band name is Apollo Celine. The drum set right behind me. And yeah, we, as mentioned, new song every single Friday.
We'll send you it.
Yeah, we'll send you all the links.
I will look forward to that.
Do you have a vinyl record player that you still use?
I got rid of it like a fool. I'm sorry. No, I don't.
I would send you one if you had one.
I don't. But anything digital. I'd love to hear you guys.